Readex started working with the American Antiquarian Society, where Nan works, a little over 55 years ago on a project that really sort of unbeknownst to us did involve a great deal of graphic material. The Evans and Shaw microfilm collection with 80,000 books has some 14,500 engravings in it. My predecessors probably weren't aware of this, but the American Antiquarian Society was greatly aware of it, and with its usual foresight, began to not only tabulate, assign numbers to, but to catalog separately all of those 14,500 engravings, which form the basis for the CAPE project, the Catalog of American Engravings. More than that, the American Antiquarian Society began forging past 1820 to start looking at a much bigger project to catalog, well, to find, study, and catalog all early American engravings to 1900, a massive project. In 2006, after we had digitized Evans and Shaw, the Society approached us with the idea of looking at American broadsides and ephemera. They had cataloged some 30,000 selected images from their long to 1900 CAPE, extended CAPE project, and that formed the basis for American broadsides and ephemera. And here again, I have to confess, I was now the publisher at Readex, and I honestly wasn't thinking that much about the graphic elements of the broadsides part of that collection. What intrigued us, me especially, was that broadsides, unlike books, which were really created by the higher strata of American economic life and for that same strata, broadsides were published by every level of American society. We think of them as political tracts, but broadsides covered a wide range, all sorts of things. There were brief political manifestos at the local level, brief family histories, life stories, so on. It was only in the reading room of the American Antiquarian Society, sitting with one of Nan's predecessors there, Georgia Barnhill, the curator of graphic arts at the time, and having her roll out tray after tray after tray of loose sheets on which was the most amazing array of images I'd ever seen. We had gotten into the era where printing allowed the advent of color. And when I looked at the clipper ship advertisements alone, I realized that the images here is what is going to make this sell and be researched. And that's exactly what happened. Since that product came out, most of the great reviews we've gotten and the usage we've seen has been for how to research graphic items in that collection. Nan's talk today is going to be about how to use it for teaching as well as research. She's the head of the Chavik Center there, the Center for American Visual Culture. She also teaches at Smith College. Nan took her undergraduate degree at Cornell in art and art history, has her Ph.D. from the University of Iowa in American Studies. So with that, let's welcome Nan Wolverton.
All of us every day are bombarded with visual culture on a regular basis, whether it's TV, billboards, social media, magazines, newspapers. We are constantly inundated with visual imagery. And the same was true for early Americans. The array of materials that people were exposed to sometimes is surprising to us when we think of people from in early America. And I just wanted to start with an image of the bill poster's dream, which you can just read, I think, at the bottom here on our version at the American Antiquarian Society. The title is cut off a little bit, but this just shows it is a humorous print intended to poke fun at just how much was out there for people to see on a daily basis. So these are prints that these bills include a lot of visual imagery, but also in this case a lot of text. But just to sort of set the scene for that sense that there was a lot that people were exposed to on a regular basis. What I'd like to do today is to sort of throw at you the array of print genre that was out there. And I've divided this talk up into different genres to sort of look at what was available. Not to spend a lot of time talking about each image, but again, to give you an overall sense of what was available and how it might be used for teaching in the classroom, but also by scholars. And I think that the visual image is something that sometimes is overlooked as an important source of evidence. And so what I'd like to stress here is that the visual can enhance the written record, but it also can teach us something significant about which sometimes the written record can be silent or ambiguous. When in my teaching, I find that the visual material can often serve as an important point of entry for students who may not otherwise become engaged with a topic. So as an instructor in American Studies, I get students from a variety of disciplines, from the humanities, but also from the sciences. And it's really wonderful to present imagery to these students and see what kind of feedback I get, their take on it, their perspective. And we go back and forth a lot, just looking at what kind of response and then try to place these materials in context. I feel it's very important to get students to an archive to really see the real materials, to get a sense of the tangible, the object. This happens to be a group of graduate students who came to the American Antiquarian Society for a seminar to learn about visual culture, so we put out an array of materials for them to look at. And it is quite wonderful to see how they respond to these materials and how they think about how they might use these in their research. I also use the digital image in the classroom. Clearly, it's not always logistically possible to get students to an archive, certainly not on a daily basis, but this is where the digital imagery comes in. It's extremely important to be able to certainly just develop an awareness of what is out there. And for researchers who come to our library, certainly making materials digitally available is what develops that awareness. And it doesn't necessarily discourage from researchers coming to the library, because often it just encourages them to come to see the real thing. Any number of times I've been in the reading room and encountered researchers who will point out something and say, you know, I saw this online, but I didn't see that red line there. I didn't know that was there, and that was very important if they're looking at a map, for instance. So I think having both the actual materials to work with and having the digital resource are both really crucial, certainly for researchers and for students today. So I'm going to start by looking at some illustrations from annuals and books, just as a way to get us going. And since this is a breakfast talk, I thought I'd start with some breakfast images to demonstrate how images can be interpreted from a variety of perspectives. First, just a word about annuals and gift books. As many of you no doubt are aware, these were published in the United States mostly before 1870, very popular in the 1840s and 50s. That's when they were most popular during that period. They come out of a British tradition. These very elegantly bound little books, really charming. They come in various sizes, but often they're just tiny. We have ours cataloged at A, B's, and C's according to size. And they're just fun to look through. But I just did a quick search for breakfast images. This one happens to say, "Here, my friend's family," but I use this as a way of demonstrating that images often get recycled, they get reused. And this is the second version of this scene showing a family at breakfast. The first one was titled The Breakfast Table. It was a woodcut in an annual published in 1841, and then in the next year it was published as an engraving, copper engraving. This very same scene. just different technology. And I won't get into the technology of printing, but just goes to show that this was an image that was popular, is well received, and therefore was reproduced again for the consumer in a later version of a gift book. The text that accompanies this image in its original version in the breakfast table it's a poem, and it's explains that the father has been overseas for a long period of time. He's just come back and is enjoying breakfast with his family for the first time in a long time. And he discusses everything that they're looking at on the breakfast table and how much of it has come from over the seas. So he comments on how the cloth on the table is from Holland, a particular type of linen called Holland because it comes from that country, very refined linen. The coffee from Java, the tea from China, and so forth. So it's a great way to get into this topic of transatlantic trade, imports, the sorts of things that come into the household, and then just family life, daily life, and also issues of class, because you can see, and this is what I like to do, is to put an image up and let students just respond to it and have an initial response, and then we discuss what it is that we're seeing, and in this case, how it might relate to the text that accompanies it. But you see here the servant in the background, and so often servants, slaves, are at the margins of these images. They're in the background, they're in the shadows, or at the outer periphery of the scene. The postures of the family members, the mother here sitting very demurely, sort of to one side, the father very relaxed. There are all kinds of things that can be discussed when looking at images like this. Another breakfast image, this one again from an annual called Breakfast at the Door. This is, again, 1841, 42. Shows three children sitting outside the door having their breakfast with the family pet. And this is not just a sentimentalized scene. This certainly has that quality to it. But again, the poem that goes with this is about that sort of country and urban divide. The author describing how these children are enjoying sitting outside. If they lived in an urban setting, they wouldn't be able to do that. So this tells us a lot about the period, the sort of attitudes toward city life, rural life. The poem goes on to explain or describe how beautiful the countryside is. But it's about home and habitation where people feel most comfortable. But also the animal, the cat in here is somewhat significant because we see a lot in imagery of this period, particularly for children, the use of pets. This is the beginning of a period when there's this sort of ethic of kindness that's coming into play, and this relationship between children and pets, and the sort of comparison of how pets need to be cared for as children do. And so we see this a lot in children's literature, this sort of showing pets within the domestic space, interacting with humans. And this is the beginning of the prevention of cruelty to animals in this period, part of a reform movement. And there's nothing like children's literature to give us a sense of what a culture wanted to communicate to its next generation. So this is Dame Trot and her cat, showing the dame with her cat seated and having a conversation. There's a whole series of images in this short story, but just show the continuity across genres. Another scene, this is one of my favorite images. This is called The Novel Reader. This is also from an annual from 1849 to 56. This image gets reused, but it's accompanying a short story by N.P. Willis. So this is, for literary scholars, I think it's very important for them to recognize the importance of the image and how the image interacts with the text. Certainly for literary scholars, those in women's studies as well, this is a scene that's very telling and very compelling, and something that students can really look at carefully and read just as an image, even without the text. You can see that the dog is while the woman is sitting here reading a novel, chaos ensues within the household. The dog is getting at the bread, the cat's getting at the cream and the milk, the baby is crying, the husband's wondering what she's doing here, the maid is saying there's somebody at the door, everything's falling apart, and clearly it's all about the wife and mother not fulfilling her duties, who delights only in the false excitement of an overfed and pampered imagination, the trials of reading a novel. The illustrations in books can be, even in local histories, are a great source for images that we might not necessarily think to look in. This is Nonantum and Natick, 1853, published by Sarah Jacobs. It's the history of Natick, Massachusetts, published for the Massachusetts Sabbath School Society. And this is an image on the left here from the last chapter called Today. So again, published in 1853. It's about the history of the Natick Indians of this area. It was one of the Prang towns. And this image was a great source for the researchers at Old Sturbridge Village, which is a living history museum in Massachusetts, in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. And so it's a source for public historians trying to get information out to visitors. They wanted to communicate the fact that in the period that Sturbridge Village represents, which is the 1830s, they wanted to be able to communicate that Native Americans were still in the area. They had not left. They were not removed to the west. They're still very much an important part of the local economy. And this image of the Native American woman basket seller, while we have references, written records, discussions of the fact that there were basket sellers, we didn't know what they looked like, how they dressed, how would they appear if you wanted to recreate this for the public. And so this image was really helpful in developing this character. This woman, Marge Bruchak, is actually a historian, teaches at University of Pennsylvania now in anthropology, and she is a storyteller. And we used this as an indication of how she might have dressed. It's a great way to talk about cross-cultural connections in dress. Notice that she's wearing the top hat. And so there are a lot of things that she could then use in her interpretation and her storytelling, explaining her role through this use of this image. And just another example, this is such a beautiful image. This is a lithograph, hand-colored, of Mohango, an Osage woman. It's a print that was based on a portrait plate that was in Charles Bird King's History of the Indian Tribes of North America from the 1830s. And what I love about this image is that it shows, again, the use of, she's wearing calico here. She's wearing the silver. The child is holding this large silver piece metal. So there's a lot that can be discussed about trade, about the exchange of materials, and the presentation then in this portrait. So for Native American studies, it's a great resource. Other, more mundane images are also extremely helpful. This is on the left, a page from the Encyclopedia of Domestic Economy from 1845. It shows furniture for the invalid, for the sick, for the disabled. This is the sort of thing that, the sort of visual reference is really key for understanding some of the objects that are in collections, in museum collections. They might not know specifically what they were used for. This, you can sort of figure out, this looks like a chair. It's got the, the wing back here, suggesting that it might have been used as some sort of chair, but so many items are sort of move out of cultural memory if they're not used on a regular basis, several generations. My favorite example of this is the chamber pot. I was in an antique shop several years ago and saw a chamber pot described as a very large teacup. I mean, these things, if they don't, there is this loss of cultural memory and use, and so this encyclopedia does show this image right here is really clearly what this is based on. It tells us exactly how, it shows us how it was used. This would have been padded for use, but for a sick person, this part of the back goes over a bolster or pillow so that in the bed, someone who's bedridden, this can be raised or lowered. Again, a great resource for those who are interested in the history of illness, of disability, and this print on the left is from Ackerman's repository and shows a very high style wheeled chair, mechanical chair, but it then can be compared to chairs that from early America that were used for invalids, chairs that were made specifically by furniture makers, chair makers for the public. This is a very early, this is a late 18th century example with very small wheels, not terribly practical, and yet it shows us that there certainly was a need for this, and there were producers who were making it to meet that need. I'm going to move on now to prints. We've been looking largely at book illustrations. And there again, there's a great deal of overlap in these genres, but just again, to give you a sense of, again, the variety of what is out there. This is an advertising print of Phelps Arcanum, 1837. This is a patent medicine. There's a lot to look at here. That if you look closely, and again, this is the sort of thing that takes some time to really look at up close, and it's always easier to do that if you have the real thing in front of you, or if you can really do a zoom in to see. But there are people who are throwing away their crutches, pouring out the bottles of the competitors' medicines, spooning it into the baby's mouth. I mean, there's really a lot of fun imagery going on here, but it speaks to the importance of the very competitiveness of advertising and in patent medicines in particular. And so this formula was essentially a cure-all. I mean, probably largely alcohol with a few other things in there. So it was, but visually it's very large print too. This is the other thing about being able to see the actual object as opposed to the digital version. It's hard to tell when you're looking at something on a screen how large it is. This is a sizable advertising print. It's not just a tiny, tiny thing. And this one of, again, Lydia Pinkham's Vegetable Compound. This is a lithograph advertising print from 1875. She really put her face behind her product. And she developed this, she marketed it, sold it to women, so it's a product by a woman for women, very, very successful. There are versions of it still out there today. And she was a very interesting person who's also an abolitionist, member of the Female Anti-Slavery Society. So there's a lot that could be discussed when looking at an image like this, but just seeing how large her image is and how much she was really putting herself out there and putting herself behind her product. This color lithograph is I love this. I think it's just a beautiful image. But there's a lot actually going on here. And I showed this print to my students last semester and asked them to read it visually. Just what were they seeing? And after a few minutes, a student in landscape studies said, you know, this is not a plant that you would see at any one time. This is showing the cotton plant in its various stages. And she's very astute, because it's quite right. While initially we might think, well, this is just the cotton plant. Yes, very, very nice, pretty picture. But in fact, this again, you'd have to kind of see this to really be able to pick this up. But by each of these images, there's a tiny little number that corresponds to a key down here. So we see that the blossom, the bud, the bowl, when it's actually ready for harvesting and so forth. And this is a print from around 1845 to 1848 in that time frame. And it was dedicated to the cotton planters of the South. This is something that could have been purchased, would have been framed, and put in the home. by a cotton planter. So this is not just botany. This is the history of an industry, connection to slavery. There's a lot that can be discussed that one could bring into a discussion of an image like this. Again, this American fruit piece, this lithograph, hand-colored, it's a Currier and Ives from about 1872 to 74. It's another lovely picture, but if you had this in your home, where would you put it? Kitchen? I would put it in my kitchen. If this was purchased for the home, at the time it was made in the 19th century, it would have been used in the dining room. Framed, put in the dining room. Because it's about abundance. It's about the sort of imagery that was used in the dining room about America as a place of abundance. And so we see a lot of images of fruit, still lives, dead game. All of this shows up in the dining room at this period. And so there's a reason that Currier and Ives was producing this, because they knew there was a market for it. They knew this is what people wanted for their homes. And I just show this with this sideboard, a piece of furniture designed specifically for use in a dining room. And you can see that the imagery is similar here. The fruit grouping here, there's fruit all over it, but also the dead stag. And in this, now this is very high end. This is not everybody could afford a sideboard like this, but it just goes to show how, to the extreme to which this imagery was. But also here we see Native Americans on the outer edges, associating Native Americans with nature. So again, the imagery and how it gets used both for hanging on the wall and also within the space on the sideboard on which you would be placing the food to serve. This image of the Boston Insane Hospital is one that requires a little bit of explanation. It has to be understood within the context of tourism. This institution opened in October of 1818. Not perhaps something you would think you'd want to put on your wall, and yet this was among the buildings that were new and innovative at this period and that people went to see. Sort of on the tour. You could get a public tour of the Insane Hospital, the Almshouse, the Deaf and Dumb Asylum in Hartford, Connecticut. These are places that people wanted to see, to know about, because they were new and interesting, and it's the sort of imagery that, to us, might look fairly ordinary or less than interesting, but when you understand how it was seen within the period, it makes perfect sense. So this same image, you can see this center part of this print was used as the prototype for the engravers, the potters. This is a plate produced in Staffordshire in England, potters using copper plate engravings, using that print as a model to create this, because they knew there was a market for it. You might not imagine eating your meal off of this, but it was produced, it was sold by William Ridgway in Staffordshire. You can see the title here, The Insane Hospital of Boston, in his series that he produced called The Beauties of America. So so these images show up in the home in a variety of ways, on the walls and on the china. And this is a print, this is by Currier, before he connected with Ives, an early print by Currier, The Ruins of the Merchants Exchange in New York. This was a devastating fire in New York in 1835, destroyed much of lower Manhattan on a very cold December night, December 16th. It was so cold that it froze the water in the firemen's hand pumps, and so much of the whole section of the city was lost. And one of the most impressive buildings in America at the time, the Merchants Exchange, was destroyed. It was only a few years old. It was a 3-story structure, had a rotunda, had a cupola, an amazing structure. And so this was big news. And Currier created that on a print. And then it also gets reproduced on Staffordshire by the potters in England because they know that something that is a way of sort of commemorating and recognizing this event, and that people would want to, Americans would want to purchase. The English wouldn't care, but they're targeting the American public, American consumer. So the way these images get used across mediums are very, very interesting, and a great way to talk about how even significant events get replicated in various ways. Just aside from the great, the ability to really look and see the details that he's included in here, like the crates and the mechanism for fighting the fire. This was the cost of this was estimated to be like 20 million, the loss. It was really quite catastrophic. This is a print called Home Education. Lithograph, hand-colored, 1865 to 71. It's very much about the home, the art of the home. And it's a print that would have been displayed in the parlor. And you can see that it's a great way to talk about refinement in the home, the sort of accoutrements of refinement, the piano, essential. The fact that both parents are helping educate their children through music, through art. The child here is making a drawing from a print, learning from that. So social history of the home, decorative arts scholars, there's a lot going on there to learn from. And also about the history of education and the history of music. So many different areas in which an image like this would come into play. And again, the imagery that came into the home was not just put on the walls. It shows up actually on the walls in a variety of ways, not just framed and put on the walls. This is a door which from a home in Amherst, Massachusetts. It's actually from the home of Emily Dickinson's brother, her family who lived just next door to her. Her nieces and nephews use the imagery that came into the home from periodicals, from magazines, from books, cut it out and literally pasted it onto the doors of their nursery. They created actual scrapbooks too, but it's wonderful to see the use of some of the same images in the paper scrapbooks and on the doors. And their parents let them do this. It was okay for them to create their own space and to decorate it with the imagery, the visual culture that they liked, that they had available to them. And it shows an array, and it's really fun to sort of look closely at what is there and to get a sense, okay, we know that came into the home. We know that periodical was in the Dickinson family home because they took the image right out and put it on their door. Another way that the visual culture was used in the home was for display. This is I apologize for this image, but this is a print stand. And so if you didn't put something up on the wall to frame, you didn't have to frame it. You could put it in a stand in a portfolio and show it to people. So have a series of images to show your visitors who might come to your parlor. It might be in the library. You might have maps in here as well. So again, a way of, once this material becomes so abundant, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, you wanted to be able to show that you had it, that you understood it, and you wanted to show it off. Sheet music, one of my favorite examples of visual culture, and one that researchers don't use a lot. Sheet music covers. So just the imagery there is great. This is an image of Jenny Lind, the renowned Swedish soprano. Beautiful image on one of her songs. And again, it's not just an image on sheet music that gets tucked away. This is something, again, that you could display. You should display it right on the piano. You have it out there for people to see that you've got it, that you understand what it means. Maybe you went to see Jenny Lind and you wanted to be able to show that. She traveled all over, and many people saw her perform. And to have her sheet music and to be able to even learn how to play it, to play some of the songs, would be something many people would aspire to do, particularly in a refined middle class to upper middle class home. And I love this example of, this is again sheet music. Our example in the collections at the American Antiquarian Society has been cut up a bit. The bottom edge has been cut off. This is called, the song is Our Country's Flag, a New National Song, composed by George Cole, published in Baltimore in 1836. And you can see that he's very, very patriotic image. The young sailor is waving his hat in the US flag, and it's probably Fort McHenry in the background. But this has been changed at some point before it came to us. Somebody drew in a mustache and glasses on this chap, and then it was cut off. It might have even been framed. But it just goes to show how these objects also get used over time and change. People add things. So graffiti on the objects is something that can tell it, because it informs us something about that, the piece, how it was received, and how it gets used over time. Photography, of course, is a wonderful resource. And there's a great deal that one could talk about with regard to photography. I'm just going to show you a few images. Anyone recognize this fellow? It's pretty clear. It's Daniel, hard to miss with those eyebrows, that intense look that he has. Here he is again. This is a lithograph of Webster in 1854. He died in 52. The daguerreotype was taken certainly before his death. But I show both of these because it shows the symbiotic relationship between photography and printmaking. The daguerreotypes often served as a source for prints. And there was something about this new aesthetic, this new interest in photography and in daguerreotypes, which came in the 1840s, really being able to capture the essence of the individual, capture the soul. And so printmakers, as a way of enlarging, the daguerreotype, of course, is generally very small, enlarging that image, and they knew that there would be a market for that. And this one is, I think, especially nice, by Leopold Broselier, a French lithographer who came to America. He did these extraordinary lithographs, very, very realistic. And often it's the daguerreotype that provides the source for these images that people were really seeking. And Webster and Washington were, at the time of Webster's death, sort of equated. Webster was equated with Washington. Of course, everybody had to have a print of George Washington on their walls. If you had nothing else, you'd have a print of George Washington after his death in 1799. When Webster died, same sort of thing. And there were often even discussions of the fact that you have Webster and Washington together, side by side, on your wall. Another daguerreotype, this of Clara Barton. And this one I like in particular because on the left side of the case is her hair. These are very much pieces of memorabilia, the sort of souvenirs and keepsakes and memories of a person, and to have the actual hair with the image really made it very, very special for her family. And pets were photographed as well. This is Nero, the Barton family dog. And I just have to imagine that, for a daguerreotype, you have to sit still for a period of time. You can't move. I could just see the biscuit out there or something they're using to keep him focused, very much focused. And then the coloring in, sometimes these were tinted to here they're emphasizing the collar on Nero. Certainly, photographs are a great way to talk about labor history. This is a quarry in Fitchburg, Mass. This is from a series, collections of photographs that we have at the American Antiquarian Society. A lot of our researchers will use, and sometimes we have to bring them to their attention because they don't know that we've got them, but there's a great resource. There's a whole collection of houses in Massachusetts, taken by a female photographer in the late 19th century. She photographed every existing house. I really love these because they are a great example not only of architecture of a certain period, but in almost every one, the people are standing. You have to look carefully, but people are positioning themselves within these images out in front of their homes. It might not look like too much to us, but for them to be photographed with in front of their home was very important. This one is, I really love this because it shows the workers outside a chair factory, and every worker, you wouldn't get this from a written record necessarily, but you see here, they have selected pieces that they are probably associated with in the factory of all ages here. Here's this boy who's got a chair seat, this man who's got the back of the chair. These are chair parts showing their role in these factory-made chairs. This from the later 19th century, obviously. And for landscape historians to be able, and garden historians to be able to look at a photograph like this to see how the parlor is moved out of doors. And the devices that come about to create the lawn as carpet, this roller to make a very smooth carpet. So you had a place to move your furniture outside and move yourselves outside. So this is all about the new attitude toward nature, toward being out of doors that comes about in the 19th century. Stereo cards, that we have a huge collection of these at the library that, again, researchers, I think, don't make enough use of. For almost any topic or any place in the country you want to see an image of, you can usually find a stereo card. This one I especially like because it's labeled by the maker as a stereograph as an educator. And they're including here, this is sort of library setting showing all the accoutrements that go along with education and refinement, the statues, the books. In this case, they were selling as well. They were marketing this as a case to hold your collection of stereo cards. This woman is looking through the stereo viewer, and the stereo card, as you know, is a way, looking through the viewer, you see the image in 3D. So like an early ViewMaster. So you get two images. When you look through the viewer, you see one in 3D. You see how it's used, and this is a great thing to take into a classroom or to have workshop students look at to really see how it was used in the period. So if you have one of these viewers, it really makes a difference in understanding how it was viewed. Generally in parlors, a way of understanding and learning about other places to do as a sort of parlor activity. This one of a factory scene, I think this is a clock factory, clock works. All the female laborers here doing the work. There's a supervisor in the center. I mean, these just, they say a lot just without any kind of text. Sometimes there's text on the back of these, sometimes they're not. And they're often parts of series. This man who is, I believe, a cobbler, no text with this, but if you just look at his posture, his stance, there's a lot that can be read into this. I suspect this was part of a series about life in the South for Northerners to see this man very demurely sitting there. I've seen others like this shown, with his instruments of work. But again, there's the posture, says a lot. And this is part of a series called Cotton is King. There is some text on this. No mention of the labor force, no mention of the blacks working here. It's all about the cotton, white cotton. Really interesting, really provocative, and a great way to talk about labor and Reconstruction in the South. I'm sorry I'm clipping along here, but I just want to make sure that I get as many images out there as possible. Newspapers. I, of course, had to include this because this is the masthead for the Mass Spy, or Thomas's Boston Journal. Isaiah Thomas was the founder of American Antiquarian Society. This was his paper. He had Paul Revere do the cuts for him before he moved out to Worcester. And so this is the work of Paul Revere, a very elaborate scroll, titles here, the cartouches, and then, of course, the excuse me, the dragon and the serpent, the imagery so much associated with the Revolution. And when Thomas moves his paper out to Massachusetts, essentially to get away from the British before the Lexington and Concord is the point at which he moved it, he creates his own masthead based on what Revere had done. It's quite similar, but not quite the same. He removed some of the images. And then we jump ahead 100 years, and we get the imagery has just exploded. It's just full page images of here on Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. This scene is of the Chicago fire in 1871. Very dramatic scene, but this is news, so this has to get out quickly. This is something that you can take a long time to engrave, to get out. This is something that has to happen fast. So the technology had changed to the point that you could not just have one large block. You know, this is wood blocks. This has to be engraved, carved to get it done. The technology to get it out there quickly is that this block was would have been broken up into pieces, several artists working at the same time in a certain part of an image, and then they all have to be joined together, and then one person would be responsible for making sure that the lines all join up. So when you print it, it looks like a cohesive image. So I don't know that you can see so well in this image. You might better in this one see almost in some cases where the blocks might have lined up to get that. So there's this whole technology that develops in printing to make sure that that image gets out there and gets out in a timely way, and the engravers have to sort of keep up with it. And some were known for skills in certain areas. Some was particularly good in this case, maybe for doing rocks or trees, so that it happens as quickly and efficiently as possible. This is from, again, from Leslie's. This is called the used meat salon. Now, this image is showing it sort of out of context because you're not seeing it on the full page. We have a copy of this at the library, but our copy needs some repair work. So this is one that we acquired separately so we can use it just to talk about the image. But there's a little blurb, little written discussion that goes with this. In the abstract, you sort of look at this and what is a used meat salon? But in fact, the description is the fact that this is that the food came from hotels, the leftover, the food that hotels would throw away, and then it was sold for pennies to poor children. And this, again, is just a very small discussion, but it's all about the poor, and how the poor really shouldn't have children if they can't feed them, and yet if we have them, we have to feed them somehow. So they're here, this fellow is selling bones to these children. So great for a discussion of urban life. This was in Philadelphia, and these places existed. We thought recycled food was something new, but it's been around. Also, I always like to point out these kinds of details, talk about the need to get these things out when you've got deadlines. In printing, the printing process, the artists, and I'm always amazed when I think about how they had to always think backwards because everything's printed in reverse. In this case here, notice that they've left out an O there. And I'll show you another example later in which the N gets reversed. Sometimes the letters must be the hardest to try to think, to get reversed, to get it the right way. And speaking of recycling, this is also, believe it or not, part of the newspaper collection. Nice example of wallpaper. But in the South, during the Civil War, there was a shortage of paper. So wallpaper, leftover wallpaper rolls that might still be on a stock shelf, were used for printing newspapers. And so I love this, that we have great examples of wallpaper that we might not know about otherwise because newspaper was printed on the back of it. The ones in our collection come mostly from Louisiana or Mississippi. This one is the Confederate banner of 1862, and it's just, this image just shows that folded up so you can see the back side, if that makes sense. And of course, newspaper ads are great for the imagery that they include. If you're looking at advertising to really see what was promoted, these are two of the most expensive items in a home, a parlor organ and a stove. And so, of course, those are going to be promoted for sale in newspapers. But sometimes, even without an image, the text itself becomes visual. In this case, this is from the Anglo-African paper published in New York from 1863. And this lozenge shape here corresponds to the sale of a lozenge, a sort of vegetable powder, something that can be taken as a medicine, but they've shaped the text, and it's great. I don't actually I can't read the text for you, but they've chosen to use that as an advertising medium. I think it's a wonderful way to talk about image and text. Ephemera is all over the place. There's so much. This is the stuff that gets thrown away generally. The things that we have today, like theater tickets, receipts, stuff that we don't keep. Fortunately, people tended to save things. We have fabulous examples of, and so much information can be gleaned from ephemera, and I think a lot of researchers don't make enough use of it. I'm just going to show you a few trade cards. This warehouse, wallpaper warehouse from Boston, but it shows us how this paper was sold, how people purchased it, that both men and women were in there at the same time making these purchases. This fellow probably works for the shop and is carrying paper in and out. So lots going on there to document. This is from a fancy chair manufactory. Shows us the whole process from the lathe turning for the posts, assembly, doing the seat, and then the decorating room, mixing and grinding of the pigments and the painting. So all of that nicely documented visually on this trade card. Receipts, in this case, this is a bill head for a furniture maker in Litchfield. And these sorts of cuts get repeatedly used, but it does tell us what this maker wanted to use to represent what he sold, in addition to the text that tells us what kind of terminology he was using for his product. Boot, shoe, comb, and trunk trade card from Charleston, South Carolina. This image is fun to see, again, how students, if they look at it for a while, they begin to say, oh, okay, so why are there curtains up there? This must be the home of the merchant, lived upstairs, worked downstairs. Also the street scene, again, just a lot that can be used interpretively. This is a crockery and glass warehouse in Boston. I particularly like this because of all of the examples of crockery that were sold. And then it also shows the grates and the sort of down section as well, how these spaces were used for marketing goods. Then we get into the really colorful examples, the new show windows of the elegant furniture and carpet stores. This in New York, it shows the change in marketing and for consumers, and you really get a sense of what they're selling. But also shows the very fashionable people out front walking by, looking and taking it all in. And I love to compare this with this fashion print from the same period, but look at the way the postures of these are all spring and summer fashions from 1842. This same sort of trope used for showing people, but what's behind them? Right, this is the Niagara Falls, another one of these popular places for people to go on tour. But it reminds me of some of the advertising today when you have models placed in front of these very exotic places. So again, it's the same sort of imagery that they're using on the trade card. Civil War envelopes. These, we have thousands of these. Anybody recognize this fellow? I wouldn't necessarily expect you to know who he is, but he's very colorful there, very well known in the Civil War because he was the first conspicuous casualty of the Civil War. He was killed in 1861 when he was cutting down a rebellion flag in Alexandria, Virginia. And so Ellsworth is known. In fact, he's still celebrated today in his memory of his death in May of 1861. So he's commemorated on a Civil War envelope. These were produced by makers. They were largely collectible. This is the sort of thing that you could acquire to collect, to show, because of the imagery on them. And Louis Prang, who was a maker, lithographer in Boston, even produced books that you could buy to put them in for sale to show. So you might then have it in your parlor and show your collection. Sort of the way we do sort of carte de visites were collected in that way. Or we think of baseball cards. You know, these were items that were small enough. They were used as envelopes, but I think more so as collector items. This one showing a woman working in the kitchen. If I cannot fight, I feed those who do. And this one showing called Southern Currency, the North Star, with all of the African Americans heading north. So the range is incredible on these, and I only show you a few just to point out that that's a great source of information, the visual imagery that shows up on these. Political cartoons, social satire, I'll just show a few. This one you may recognize from your invitation. This is Mr. and Mrs. Bull reflecting on the taxes. Hand-colored engraving. This is a British print, but it is used and viewed in America. And we know this because there were print sellers, shops, people who would acquire prints, bound them, and then send them out, rent them out for people to use for entertainment. So a fellow in New Hampshire, a bookseller, Charles Pierce, in 1807 had a collection of these that he would rent out, hire out for 20 cents an hour for entertainments, for tea parties and so forth. And the one that he had was a mixture of British prints and American prints. This one called A Philosophic Cock by James Aiken, who was American cartoonist. So this is an 1804 hand-colored engraving that was in Pierce's volume, and clearly it shows Thomas Jefferson represented as a rooster, cock, and Sally Hemings, the black hen next to him. You can see that this, really poking fun at Jefferson and knowing, knowledge that Sally Hemings was likely his mistress. Another by Aiken, this a little bit later, The Old Cabinet Varmints. Sorry about the food imagery here, but I guess you've all finished eating. These rats are representing Andrew Jackson's administration. So again, this hand-colored lithograph shows it. And again, there's just a lot that's going on here. The text helps. Sometimes these political cartoons are so specific to a particular event that may have happened that it can take a little while to really figure out, okay, what are they getting at here? What is it that we're seeing? But it's great fun to work with that, and it really helps to know precisely what year something was issued, because they can be so very specific in what they're portraying. This is showing the progress of intemperance in New England, 1841. This is all about moral reform, politics, and religion. And the striped pig. The striped pig is used to represent men who would drink. Because it was used particularly in dry towns in New England, where you weren't supposed to sell alcohol or spirits by the glass. If you had a militia day event, you might get a pig, stripe it, just put stripes, black stripes of paint on it, put it in a tent, And the men would go and say, oh, I'm going to go see the striped pig, and they'd pay 6 cents to see the striped pig, and then they'd get a complimentary glass of rum. So it's very much a strategy for being able still to sell rum under the guise of just seeing the striped pig. So this kind of imagery people were familiar with, might not be, students today may not be as familiar with why would that pig be striped. So you have to sort of dig into it. The coroner's inquest on local Focoism, there are lots of images, lots of cartoons addressing the local Focos, which was this radical democratic wing of the Democratic Party, and constantly lampooned. This one sort of playing on the deathbed scene that shows up so much in visual imagery. We often see when somebody, important person dies, it's very public. When William Henry Harrison died, public scene, this is the imagery that goes with it. So people were aware. So here they're showing the death of this party and all of these characters having their say as to why it was dying. And these are very recognizable faces. People knew who these individuals were because of the quantity of this material that was out there, and in portraiture and from daguerreotypes. These things were, quite commonly seen. Another image that you will recognize, Broadway promenaders, latest style. This is social satire, but it's also political, and it's on first glance, you just see the top of it, you might see, well, this is, this couple, he's got this sort of look that makes you suspicious of him, but it's his dress. It's the dress that really, striped pants, the very, very ornately dressed, and just his posture and gesture. This is from 1846. And the text that accompanies it does give us indication as to the intent here. Notice, by the way, the reverse N in saloon. So there's a case when the lithographer got the N backwards. This is all about the Mexican-American War, though, in 1848. So the dialogue is that she is asking him why he hasn't, hasn't he joined the gallant fellows on the Rio Grande, which is, of course, where the war broke out. And he's saying, well, why would I'm much happier here with you. Why would I soil my gloves with dirty, vulgar gunpowder? And so there is this really poking fun at him for not being involved in the war. It's about gender, it's about masculinity, it's about social satire in general. And really poking fun at both of them here. She is described as a sick kitten leaning against a warm brick. And these kinds of broadsheets by mid-century were published in huge quantities, from 50 to 100,000, distributed. If they're political, they were distributed to party headquarters or sold from newspaper offices, so certainly it was out there. The effects of the Fugitive Slave Law, 1850. This is a great image that really can be interpreted there's a lot going on in here, just looking at the dress of these men. These are Northern African Americans. This is an anti-slavery print. Note that there are excerpts from the Declaration of Independence and from the Bible, saying what the effects of the Fugitive Slave Law, that these men, while they're free Northerners, and you can tell by the way they're dressed, this man has a walking stick. He's clearly of a higher status. These are laborers, working men, and yet this elite hunting party is shooting at them simply because they are black and in the North, and this law that came out of the Missouri Compromise allowed that. So by use, probably commissioned by the Anti-Slavery Society for distribution. Same with this one, showing the beauties of the extension of the area of slavery. So this is satirizing the abuses and contradictions of slavery, and without spending too much time reading all of this, essentially the balloons explain to us that in fact he is selling this young woman And it's clear from the text that it is actually his own child, looks like him. This is his son. There's like a sister to me. So clearly, really emphasizing the contradictions of slavery and these slave owners. He wants to sell her so he can buy a carriage to take his family to church. Women's rights. This lithograph from 1870, lampooning women in political office and civic rights, civic life. And again, you can see there are all kinds of imagery going on, just making fun of what if women were police, what if women were the sheriff, what if women, here's another case of women in the home just putting her feet up when she should be working. I mean, all these sorts of things. It's great fun to see how the students respond to this. And then I'm going to conclude with just a few broadsides. This is a very powerful image that I find students, it takes a little while for them to process, but it's a visual representation of a slave ship during the Middle Passage. And I think there's nothing like, I mean, they can read about this, but there's really nothing like seeing these bodies lined up, packed in, that really makes the point. And that was the intent, clearly, in the period, and it has a very profound effect on students when they see this. From 1789, this one from a London printer, and then it gets used in the States as well as for anti-slavery. The gerrymander, I love this because it shows the effects of the gerrymander, essentially making creating this serpent. So again, this is very political, a new species of monster, it's called, and this appeared in the Essex area and up north of Boston in 1812. You can see an enlarged version over there showing the towns and how they're kind of carved up to create this serpent. And then finally, this broadside of the tea destroyed by Indians. Clearly, this is the Boston Tea Party. The song accompanying it is in 6 stanzas extolling the Boston Tea Party of 1773. But it's the relief cut up there that makes it very appealing of the ship, indicating where the tea was thrown from. And I will just end with my favorite object in the collections, which is in fact a small bottle of tea that was apparently salvaged by a boy at the age of 5 from the beaches of Dorchester, where the tea had sort of washed up after the Boston Tea Party. He collected this, and years later in 1840s, he donated this to the American Antiquarian Society as a sort of an example of remembrance. This is a period when people were really remembering the Boston Tea Party in the 1830s and 40s because so many of the participants had died off and it wasn't such a secret thing anymore, so you wanted to kind of know who was actually participating. He wasn't the only one who had tea, and there were bottles of tea all over the place. In fact, one fellow claimed that he took part in the Tea Party in the 1840s and came to Chicago and had a vial of tea, put a vial of tea and himself on exhibit, and people paid to see him and to hear his stories. He was a bit of a huckster, but he knew that there was interest. And so we have this on view. And there are a few other institutions who have them as well. But it's a great way to talk about what is saved, what is not, and even something as ephemeral as tea can be saved and put on display and conserved. Thank you very much.